Hey guys, this is What If Deku was the 1000th user of, well, One For All. Let's get into it. So we start our story off with Izuku Midoriya, way before his story actually, as we start our story off in, well, Egypt. Deep in Egypt. Now, for this story to work, for One For All and All For One to be a lot more older, we start our story off with, well, the Egyptian era, as, well, Egypt. During this time, a pharaoh far in the past would have been born, and him eventually having two sons, being the very older versions of, well, All For One and One For All. Them having a twin connection as well, them being twins, but him being basically All For One being the youngest one, as he would come about like 1 hour after the first one being born, aka All For One. Now, All For One and his brother would have been the two sons of, well, the city, as they would have been the princes, as they would have been worshipped high and low. Many of the maidens wanted him and wanted the brothers at every chance they could. Now, somehow the youngest brother had a unique color tone, white hair, but it was confusing, but also unique. But what would happen is, over the years, eventually they too, one of the brothers would inherit and develop a quirk, alongside a couple of about 20 to 16 different people around the capital inheriting and having quirks, as this would be the first isolated, well, awakening of quirks around the globe. What would happen is, during this time, well, people would start to get pushed against and basically overran by, well, the pharaoh. The pharaoh would eventually fight against these, eventually finding out one of his sons was a quirk user and about to execute one of his sons. He already had two, as he was about to kill his eldest son, as his eldest son would have fought back, overthrowing the capital in the city and taking his father's life. Of him eventually coming as far as to take other quirk users' powers, as majority of them would have been, well, dethroned, aka like basically their legs chopped off, them being scalped, and all sorts of other things, like them being completely utterly destroyed and basically making their quirks useless in their hands. So, well, All For One would have taken their powers. He would have taken multiple different quirks in the last couple of years of him ruling the, well, pretty much area, as eventually him becoming lustful for power, as he would have started to overthrow other well, pretty much empires, and started to basically make a huge war out of nothing, trying to basically tell the world that quirk users are the new generation of humans and they are gods amongst men, as he would have started to fight against more and more different parts of Egypt. Him eventually being overthrown and overpowered by another part of an isolated group of people that had quirks, as he would try to live in harmony, but not try to overthrow other capitals and other people, not try to kill and destroy other people's worlds and lives and legacies and their life blood, as eventually they would have been helped by, well, the younger brother. One For All, he was good in heart, and he didn't want his brother to destroy the world just because he thought he was better than everybody else. He may have been, but just because you have power doesn't mean you can become an evil tyrant. It doesn't mean you can use your power to bully others and become something that's considered, well, in modern times, the word for it would be a villain. But right now, he's the monster of the story. As what would happen is, well, One For All would have fought back against his brother. During this time, he would have fought back against his brother after about the last couple of years, him being given the stockbounding quirk from his brother after he would have killed their father, as eventually his brother would have been basically brought onto the other side by the other more harmony and more good-hearted quirk users on the other side of the, well, Egyptian era, as they would have started to fight against their brother, or against, well, One For All. Not One For All, All For One. As All For One would have fought against them, eventually them getting overwhelmed, but also All For One being overwhelmed as well. Eventually, this huge debacle would have destroyed both areas, and their part of history would have been swiped clean off the face of the earth. The history and even the mention of quirks would have been lost in that time. no one even knowing quirks existed at that far in time, that back in time. What happened is during this time, well, One for All would have left, and All for One would have left as well. One for All would have kept on passing on the quirk decade by decade, year by year, it passing and basically building up about 1,000 users over the decades until it reached modern time. Doing the other part of time with All for One would have used his quirk over the years and him racking up a bunch, and I mean a bunch, of powers over the decades. Eventually, becoming so powerful over the decades, him attaining more abilities and quirks over the years. As he would eventually, over the years, castrate himself, going into deep sleep, using some quirks like a sleep quirk that could allow the user to go to sleep for decades and millions of years without even aging a day. As another quirk he got was the ability to live about 5 to 16 times longer than the average human lifespan, and add about 16 to 17 years onto your lifespan. As he would have used his quirk, as he would attain more and more abilities that would allow him to increase his lifespan, but him eventually finding a shortage of quirks around about 20 to 50 years later after the big debacle in Egypt. As what would happen is he would find himself, mummifying himself, going into a deep sleep in a tomb. Him finding himself awake about a couple years later during the medieval age. As he would have woken up around that time, him stealing more quirks, as near the medieval age, quirks would have became bigger, as quirks would have flared up once again in that isolated area and around England to London to a bunch of other areas. As now in this time frame, quirks would have manifested. Only about 1% of the population around the whole world would have started to have quirks again. But it's slowly starting to die out, and majority of people just thinking it was some sort of folklore. Majority of all folklores and pretty much fruitions would be made out of the myth and the false thinkings of people that had quirks, aka people that had quirks that assimilated like werewolves or vampires. All of them would be called werewolves and vampires. So people that had quirks that would allow them to turn into like an animal or something would be called shapeshifters, as other creatures that were tall and big and people that had quirks that made them look like monsters would be called complete monsters, as the world would see them as monsters, witches, warlocks, and all sorts of other things, as eventually majority of them being killed before they could reproduce, making sure quirks would basically die out during that time frame. As that time frame would have gone out, before it went completely stitched, before that flame was snuffed out by the fruition of angry mobs and people that hated and thought all that stuff was real, basically what happened is, All for One would have used his time to rack up more quirks from different people, as he would have racked up a lot more power. During this time, One for All was still being passed on. One for All being passed on to the majority of quirkless people around the decades, since majority of quirks were going extinct. And majority of quirks over the decades would have started to go away. So only about 1,000 quirk users were basically given the quirk. So only 1,000 people that had quirks would be able to get the quirk and pass it on to other people. So only 1,000 quirk users were able to attain the quirk. All the others that would have passed on the quirk since those 5,000 years of the Egyptian era all the way to the modern time would have been all quirkless humans that would have basically just stockpiled the quirk, using their strength and their abilities and their physical anatomy to basically make the quirk stronger just on pure strength. Majority of them just keeping to themselves and fighting against wars and all sorts of other things. Majority of big-time heroes and world-class soldiers would have had All for One. Sorry for my voice. Would have had One for All, as majority of heroes like King Arthur would have also had One for All, as he would use his power to save the world time and time again, or save his land time and time again. As he would also have a quirk himself, actually, as he would have a lightning quirk, as we would get more into that later. Now what would happen is during this time, quirks would have died out, and the cycle of, well, one for all being passed on the quirkless people would happen once again. Now, what happened was we get switched to modern time, and around this time, the big final showdown between a one quirk user and another quirk user would have happened, and eventually the opening of the world of everybody in the world would start to develop quirks a lot faster and a lot more virally, as quirks wouldn't die out this time. They would become the norm, and they would be built on society's shoulders. Society would have been built off the shoulders of quirks. As what would happen is, All for One would have used this experience, would have used this basically opportunity to come out of the shadows, as he would have awoken from the sense of more quirks and more of his children being born, the children of quirks, as he would have awoken from his sleep, his slumber. What would happen is he would have came across this new world, and eventually he would find himself a help with the doctor, as the doctor would have stitched him up, since his quirk would have not kept him too good shape over the thousands of years, him being given another quirk to keep himself younger and a lot more longer alive. Now what would happen is, All for One would have seen his brother, or he thought he was his brother, as it would be kind of a doppelganger of his brother, kind of a descendant of his brother, since his brother did have children during the Egyptian era, and somehow that legacy kept on going for about 5,000 years. So, to put it simple, yeah, he would have a descendant, some sort of great nephew, as he would have tried to lure this nephew to his ranks and try to convince him to be a part of his family, be a part of him, be a part of this new legacy he's trying to build on the shoulders of quirks becoming fruition to the universe. As what would happen is he would fight against this person, and him slowly and surely getting murdered by All for One. Now, All for One, as All for One would have killed him, but before he killed him realizing that he had, One for All. One for All would have been passed down to him by another user a couple of months ago, as he would have realized that it was someone else that had the quirk, someone else that had the power, as he would have been furious by this, but him mainly spending majority of his time to try to rack up more points and become a bigger name in society and in the history books, as he knows from now on he will not go back into his slumber. He needed to step into the world of quirks and stay there permanently. Now we get switched to modern time. With Deku and All Might and their conversation, and All Might offering the quirk to Deku. During this time, Deku starts his 9-month arc training, as it's a lot more intense than canon, and All Might honestly basically makes Deku train his booty off. I mean, Deku trains his booty cheeks off. I mean, god damn! Bro is doing straight up somersaults and suicides every morning, day, and afternoon. He has no breaks doing running. And physical training like push-ups, bro does about 1,000 to 7,000 push-ups a day. Twice a day! Like, bro, what? Like, he's literally pushing Deku to his bones. Deku went to the hospital about 3 times doing this 9-month arc training. Like, Deku pushed himself to his max. Deku's reached about peak human strength around the end of the 9-month arc training, for a 16-year-old at least. So what happened during this time, Deku starts to get ready for the entry exams. Deku would have walked through the entry exams, as he would have came across Ochaku the same way. Them actually talking for a little bit longer, since Deku would have a little bit more confidence in himself, since All Might would have talked to him more as a father figure a lot earlier on in the series. Now, All Might would have given him a little bit of tips about flirting and all that other stuff, as Deku would have basically found himself a little bit subconsciously influenced by about the last couple hundred users of One for All, as he would be a lot more flirtatious like one other user in, One for All. As what would happen is during this time, he would have talked to her a little bit more than usual in the original canon, but them just walking away saying good luck to each other, as she would have kind of blushed a little bit walking away from him, as Deku would be kind of happy by this. As we will see that Izuku would have pushed himself farther, as he would start to do sit-ups and push-ups to warm up in the middle of the entry exams for the combat training. Now what would happen? The practical exam, the written exam, Deku getting a pretty good score, as we would see that Deku would have gotten ready, as he would have jumped over the wall before it opened after President Mike would have told everybody to go. Deku jumping to robot, bashing their brains in with 1%, as 1% would have been strong enough for Deku's body to take, as he would only be able to take about 10%. As during this time, 10% would be around the equivalent of 40 to 60 to 70% of One For All, as it would be a lot more stronger, like I said, it being about 1,000 to 5,000 years old, as well, One For All would have been a lot stronger. As, like I forgot to mention, since it would have been a lot stronger, and also it would have been around a lot longer, other users would have already known that you could, well, obtain quirks from past users and use them as your own. As what would happen is during this time, All Might would have been able to obtain the ability of float from his previous master, meaning that All Might would be able to fly, and All Might would have also been a lot stronger, around Superman levels of strength. So All Might's pretty much an influence on society would have been way bigger, since he would have been a way more powerful hero, and him saving a lot more lives. So all the people he saved in original canon would have been doubled by 5 to 6 times the people. So yeah, so Deku would have literally looked up to All Might a lot more in this canon, and All Might would have been a lot stronger in this canon as well. Deku would have been basically blitzing through these robots like nothing, but him still being kind of overpowered by the sheer power One For All has. Him eventually coming across a zero pointer, him about to run off, but him hearing a similar voice of screaming, as he would have looked away, and he would look behind himself, seeing Ochaku under some rubble. As Deku would have ran over there as fast as he can, kicking some rubble off of her, as Deku had been kind of confused and actually kind of surprised that it was that easy to use his quirk in his legs, but him rushing that idea out of his head before he was about to get stumped by a zero pointer. As in this split second, Deku whole life flashed over his eyes. The zero pointer was about to stomp on both of them, and some of the pro heroes are too far away to stop it from killing them. As Deku, in this split second, reached out his hand, trying to stop the zero pointer, as a huge bolt of lightning would have shot out of Deku's hands. It striking the zero pointer's foot clean off and electrocuting and frying the systems, taking out the zero pointer for good. As Deku looked at his hands, it shocking with electricity and it glowing bright blue, but it eventually fading away, as it would have been kind of confusing and shocking to Izuku. Ochaku would have looked up, as she would have told him that, "Are you okay?" And him saying, "What? Why are you asking me that? I should be asking you that," as he chuckles a little bit, as he grabs her and runs her off to a recovery girl. During the time, the rest of the match, or the rest of the entry exams, Deku tries to rack up more points, but eventually, the entry exam ends. After that, we get switched to a couple days later, as Deku's still waiting for the note in the mail, as he gets 2 notes actually, 1 note from All Might and 1 note from the school. One of the notes he opens up from All Might, as it's from the school, All Might's note to him telling that he got into UA and blah blah blah, as Deku's super happy by this, and his mom shouts and, well, pretty much congratulates him as well. As Deku goes out to eat with his mom that night, as his mom is in the restaurant paying it off, as Deku's in the car about to join his mom for the dinner, as he basically opens the note and sees that it's, well, All Might. As All Might tells Izuku that his power is growing, as he hasn't told Deku everything about One For All, but he needs to tell him something very powerful. He needs to tell him something very crucial to his story, that previous owners of One For All could use the quirks of other previous owners, and you use the quirk of King Arthur. Izuku was kind of confused by this, saying King Arthur, as Deku would have gone on, and Deku would have been explained that the quirk's been around for thousands of years, like All Might said, as the first time, the whole conversation between both of them would have changed a little bit, him saying that the quirk has been passed down generation to generation, as it's now is your turn, Izuku Midoriya, as you're supposed to be my successor, blah blah blah. As what would happen is Deku would have been kind of shocked by this, as he would have been kind of happy as well by this. Now, I'm going to leave it off here, guys. So, basically what happened is, let's just switch, the whole, entrance exam, the whole, Aizawa, everything like that. Everything around that time would have happened exactly the same. So, next part, I'm going to start off with the combat training. So, I hope you guys enjoy the video, because I can subscribe. As always, guys, have a blessed day. Deuces.